Just wanted to mention at a high level, like what Equidox is. So Equidox is a PDF remediation tool. It's a web-based application, and it's designed to increase the efficiency and the speed and the ease of use when it comes to remediating PDF documents and making them accessible for ADA compliance. So primarily what we're doing here is we're taking PDF documents and we are making them usable to people that have disabilities, primarily people that are visually impaired. So that's really what Equidox is designed to do. If you're currently using Adobe Acrobat, think of Equidox as at least a supplement, if not a total replacement to using Adobe Acrobat, which is a very slow and manual and tedious tool to learn. And it's just a very time-consuming process if you have a lot of documents. So Equidox is designed to increase your efficiency and speed things up for you. And if you're not doing any PDF remediation at all, and you're on this call or you happen to be watching this recording in the future, Equidox is just an easier way to learn how to do this because the interface and the workflow and all of the steps are kind of geared towards making this fast and easy for remediation specifically. Whereas Adobe Acrobat is kind of like a Swiss Army knife for all things related to PDF. So it's a much more complicated tool. So with that said, the first thing that I want to mention is, of course, that Equidox is a web-based application. So you'll see here that I am working in my browser. If you have a choice of which browser you're using, I do recommend using Google Chrome. Equidox is hosted on the Google Cloud platform. And so some of the components of the architecture are kind of best geared to work with Google Chrome. I would say that my second choice would be Microsoft Edge. So if you don't use Chrome or you can't use Chrome for whatever reason, I would say choice number 2 would be Edge. It will work with other browsers, but I always warn people, like if you're using Internet Explorer still, which trust me, there are people that do that, you're probably going to have some issues because Equidox is just a very modern application and there's a lot of complexities kind of happening behind the scenes. So if you can use a very modern, up-to-date version of Chrome, that would be most optimal. Now, what we're looking at here, I'm actually in your account. So anyone that's set up as an administrator moving forward, if you log in one day and you see my documents in here, that's kind of by design. Administrators are able to see everything that's in the account and being worked on. But for most of you, if you're going to be a standard user, when you log in for the very first time, you are going to see a blank slate. So you won't see like any of these documents here. But these documents are just documents that have been imported over the various days, weeks, months by other colleagues and people that are working on documents. So for training purposes, just to get everyone kind of up to speed, I'm going to import some documents. So just to see what that process looks like, if you want to bring some documents into the system to work on, go to the third tab over here on the left-hand side where it says Import Documents. That will take you to this view where you can click to open up your folders, or if you have your folders already open like I do, I can also just take some files and just do like a drag and drop into this rectangular area. When I drop those files into this rectangular area, they're going to upload to the cloud. So that's what these check marks are indicating. So I'm just essentially taking an exact replica of these documents off of my hard drive and loading it up into the cloud. And once they finish uploading to the cloud, I will get a blue import button that will pop up. It should here any second. Here's my import button. And now I can bring them into Equidox. So when I'm importing documents into Equidox, what's happening right now is Equidox is looking at these files for things like existing tag structure, if there is any. Sometimes a document will already be tagged, sometimes it won't. And then for anyone that's new to PDF accessibility, tags are what we're here to do. So tags kind of organize the content in a document to make sure that it's going to be read properly by a screen reader. So we are here to make sure that we are structuring these documents in a way that's going to be making sure that the content is read like primarily in the correct order, but also that different elements are accounted for like headings and tables and lists and hyperlinks and all of these different things that could be present in a PDF document. We're here to make sure that all of those various things are tagged correctly to be able to work properly with a screen reader. Now, sometimes documents will already be tagged. That could be coming straight from the source file, like Microsoft PowerPoint slide deck or something, or an InDesign file, or some sort of word processing tool that you might use can produce some tag structure. However, the accuracy and the quality of those tags is very hit or miss. usually more on the miss side of things, I would say. So that's what you're using Equinox for, to kind of clean that up. Now, you can use the existing tag structure in a document if you want to, or if you prefer, you can kind of just strip it down and start over fresh with Equinox. It's always case by case because PDFs are all somewhat unique from each other. You don't always know what you're going to get until you get into the document itself. So you just have to kind of make that decision when it's appropriate for you and after you're evaluating the document. So like I said, you can use the tags that are there and kind of make adjustments to it if you want, or just strip it down and start over from scratch. You can also, if the document is not tagged at all, Equinox during that import process is going to run its auto detection. So this is another option of what's going on during import. The auto detection is when Equinox is going to automatically identify the various elements on the pages. So the encoded text, the images, hyperlinks, fillable form fields if there are any, pages that require optical character recognition if there is any. So that would be if you have like a scanned page or something like that. So we'll talk about these things as we go through the training today, but that's kind of what's happening behind the scenes during that import process. And then once they finish importing, now all those documents are available up here and ready to be worked on at any time. All of your documents will populate down below here. So you have like a big, sort of giant list of PDFs down below. You have pretty straightforward options for like sorting and filtering those PDFs. We won't really harp too much on kind of the searching and sorting functionality. Primarily, if I find that like most people that are remediators, you're probably working on one document at a time or a few documents at a time. Your 5 most recent documents that you've interacted with will be available up here on the very top menu, and then everything else will populate down below. So usually I'm just kind of working from what's up here, and I only go down to like the full document list if I'm trying to find like some duplicate copy that I had from, months ago or something. But usually you'll find yourself kind of sticking up here to the top with the recent documents. Okay, so these are the documents that I just imported. I'm going to start with this one here, this PDF. Now, this is a straightforward document, but it's built in a way to kind of go through a lot of like sort of universal principles that apply to every document you will ever work on in the PDF world. So we'll take our time going through this 2-page PDF, but everything that we talk about in this document is something that you can apply to virtually every document you will ever work on moving forward. So it's important to kind of like understand the basics, and then we'll of course get into some more complicated things with different element types that aren't present in this PDF. But this is a 2-page document, so I can see thumbnails for the 2 pages here, and you can click, of course, on either thumbnail and go directly to that page. You have a search feature, which is not particularly useful for this document because it's only 2 pages, but if you have a 200-page document, maybe you want to go to page 189 for some reason, and you can just type that in and it will take you directly to that page. So you don't have to scroll through all of the thumbnails. I have buttons to export it back to a PDF whenever I'm ready to do so. I'm not quite ready to do that yet, but that button is available in case you need to do like a quick export. There's a share button. So this is really important because Equinox is a web-based application, you do have the ability to share documents and work on documents with other people. So you can actually have multiple people working simultaneously on the exact same PDF. That would probably be irrelevant for such a simple 2-page document. But again, hypothetically, this is 200 pages and you need it done by the end of the day and you don't have time to like clear your calendar. So maybe you share it with your 3 best friends and everyone takes a 50-page section and you can get this document done in a fraction of the time. So sharing is an important thing to consider. You can share it with any user in the account or groups of users once you have groups created. So we don't have any groups yet, but that's something that we can talk about later. I can delete the document. Now, I don't really delete things all that often. Sometimes I get rid of like duplicates and purge things that are really old that I don't need anymore, but there's no like maximum number of PDFs that you can have in your account. So don't ever feel like the pressure to like clear space and like delete everything that you're working on. It's really not that critical. There's reasons why you might want to keep these documents in your Equinox account for future use. But I would say like just a warning, like you can delete things if you want to, but there's really no pressure to do so. There's no data caps or maximum number of files or PDFs or anything like that. You can keep these documents in your account for as long as you'd like. Down below, there are some properties of the document that I'd like to mention. I always talk about these because they are really often overlooked, but they're actually really important. So the first property to mention is the document title. Now, this PDF that we're working on here, it didn't have a title originally. So when we imported it, what Equidox did was it just took the file name and it plugged it into the document title field right here. So the first touch point that a screen reader user will have with a PDF is the document title. It's kind of like their introduction to the document. So they know if like, is this the document I want to open up and read through, or am I looking for something else? So it's actually a really important property for a blind user who's using a screen reader or some form of assistive technology. A sighted user doesn't really need to pay that much attention to the document title because you're probably seeing like the thumbnail and you can quickly figure out like, is this the right document or not? But a blind user relies on this type of information to avoid that like endless loop of opening and closing and looking through all kinds of documents trying to find the right one. Now, if we look at the file name here, like the way that I've named this file was kind of silly, but this is a pretty typical looking file name, right? Like if you have like a big batches of documents on your hard drive, you might have some sort of way of typing out your file names that organize it in a specific way. But if you're hearing this as your document title through a screen reader, this is very difficult, if not impossible, to understand. So I always try to avoid, when I'm writing a document title, like avoid the use of like acronyms and abbreviations and sort of like serial numbers that might make sense to you, but wouldn't necessarily make sense to anyone who's just surfing around and looking for something. So I always try to clean up that document title and make sure that it's clear and concise and descriptive of what the document is actually about, because this makes a big difference for the end user that's relying on that title, which would be people using assistive technology. You can add an author if you want. So if I wanted to like, type my name in here as the author, I could, or if you want to put in like your department, or if you know who the author is, if you want to add it, that's totally fine. If an author was already there, it will be pre-populated. Just so everyone knows, the author is not a requirement for compliance. So it's not like something that you're going to get flagged for on an accessibility check. Not all documents really have like a defined author, so it's not forced to add one in there. But if you want to add like an additional search term to the document, it never hurts to have it. So you can add an author as needed. You can you can change your language attribute only if you need to. So we will set it to English for you by default. But if you have documents that are in different languages, you want to make sure that you change the language attribute through this drop-down menu. The reason being is that the language attribute tells the screen reader what language sort of like library it should be reading from. So if you have an English document, you obviously want an English voice that's designed to read English words with like the proper cadence. If you have a Spanish document, then you want a Spanish voice. And that gets increasingly more important when you get into like Arabic or Mandarin Chinese, where the screen readers, if it's an English screen reader trying to read Arabic, it has no frame of reference for what any of those characters are. So it has no method of reading it. So it's an important thing to update, but I imagine, 90% of the time, you're just going to be leaving it with like the default English language attribute. If you make changes to your properties, just make sure you hit the save button right here and it will update in the file. Okay, let's jump into the first page here. So I'm going to click on the thumbnail of page 1 and it's going to take me into the remediation page. Now in the remediation page, obviously we have like a whole bunch of buttons here. So not to throw too much at you and intimidate everyone on like what all these buttons do, but I'll go through like kind of like the main functions and make sure that you're comfortable like navigating the interface. And just so everyone's aware, certain things are like duplicated up on the top section here, and they're also available on the left-hand side. So there's a little bit of redundancy in some of these buttons, but just depending on like where you're located in the interface, it's always like available up at the top. So there's not quite as much going on here as it might initially seem, but I'll walk through like, kind of how to use these different functions and what they're for and best practices. Okay, so starting on the left here, this is where you'll do like kind of like the majority of your work. Now on the left-hand side, there are two tabs. You have a page tab, which allows you to make changes at the page level. And that's where I'll start. Now, I don't really need to use this function for this page because if we take a closer look at the document, I'm zooming in, by the way, with my little magnifying glass up here. These yellow rectangles that are covering up the content, these are what we refer to as reading zones. Now, the reading zones are really the same thing as tags. They will create the tag structure when we export the document. Now, just by importing this PDF, I've already got like a good detection level from Equidox. So if you can tell, like all of my reading zones are kind of capturing the various paragraphs and their corresponding headings inside of their own individual reading zones. That's really what we're looking for. Now let's assume that I don't like my starting point. I either have like a bad detection level or the initial tag structure that came in with the file is really, really poor. One thing I can do is use this zone detector. Now this zone detector, it's available up at the very top, but it's also available here underneath the page tab as well. It's the exact same function. When you move this around, like back and forth to the left and right, you're able to kind of adjust the granularity in which Equidox is detecting all of this content. So if I bring it way over to the left, for example, I get a bunch of like individual zones covering up the lines of text inside of these paragraphs that have sort of like that 1.5 spacing. So that's not really what I'm looking for. I don't want to give a bunch of fragmented half sentences to a screen reader user who's expecting all of this to be read as like one big paragraph. And at the same time, if you bring the slider like way over to the right, it kind of takes more of like a 10,000 foot view of the page, where now I have a much less granular sort of detection. And I've got like paragraphs and headings all being combined together, which is going to be another mess just on the other end of the spectrum. So in general, you want to find like a sweet spot somewhere in the middle. You know, most of the time it's going to be somewhere in the middle. You can get away with like different settings on a page like this, you know, anywhere from like 4 to 8 would probably work well, but you just got to kind of find that sweet spot for whatever page you happen to be working on. If you have a document that is somewhat consistently formatted, you know, using the same fonts, the same line spacing, the same just general look and feel to the different pages, you might find that like, okay, a detection level of 6 is working really well, and you might apply it to all pages. So what Equidox would then do is set that detection level of 6 to every page moving forward in the document. So it just eliminates the need for you to like move that slider around every time you go to the next page. But again, that's not really necessary on a 2-page document. It's not a big deal to just nudge the slider a little bit if you have to. But if it's 20 pages or 200 pages, you know, maybe there's value in hitting apply to all. Next, so that slider again it's available up here. It's the same function. They move together in tandem just in case you're not like on the page tab and you want to use it. As a general workflow recommendation, I would say use the slider as like your first step and then start making your more precise adjustments to your zones from there. If you start adjusting your zones and then go backwards to your slider, it's going to kind of reset a lot of the work that you've just done. So you don't want to undo like all of the little sort of nuanced changes that you made to the zones. You want to retain those. So use the slider first and then start making the more precise adjustments. On the page tab, there's also a section for reading order. And much like the slider, it's available up at the top as well. And the default reading order that we will assume the page is set to is 1 column. And all that means is left to right, top to bottom. So as you kind of look through the zones here, there's a little green flag in the upper right-hand corner, which says number 1, number 2, 3, 4, so on and so forth. So as Equidox scans the page left to right, top to bottom, every time it intersects with a new zone, it will label that next in the reading order sequence. You have different options for your reading order. You can choose like 2, 3, or 4 columns. So depending on the layout of the page, it might be more appropriate to set one of these multi-column options and just simply hit the reorder button. That's available up here as well for like quick access, but you do have an apply to all pages option for the reading order as well. I very infrequently find myself using this, but you might have like, I don't know, a textbook where the design of it is like a 2-column reading order on every page. So if you've got 100 pages of 2-column layouts, then for sure I would use it. But for me, that's like a pretty infrequent sort of document to come across. But you might have examples in mind where a multi-column option and applying it to all pages is useful. Going back to like the workflow, so we said, use the slider first. In general, I recommend worrying about my reading order at the very end of the page. So it's kind of like my final polishing step. Because as I add and subtract and move zones around on the page, it could impact the reading order that I'm setting up. So I don't like to really concern myself too much with the reading order while I'm still manipulating the page. Once I've got all of the zones in the correct location and I have them all labeled as the correct zone type, that's when I like double check my reading order, make sure everything is accurate, and I move on to the next page. Now, I can't overemphasize, if you're new to PDF accessibility, like if you could do one thing to a PDF document and nothing else, in my opinion, it would be setting the correct reading order. I would argue it's the most important part of PDF accessibility, beyond like, of course, having like a tagged document, of course. If your document isn't tagged, then it's completely useless to a screen reader. But if your document is tagged, the most important part of those tags is that they're read in the correct order, because if not, it can render the entire document kind of useless, because it can fill up the end user's head with a bunch of like bad information, because things could be reading in a completely wrong order. That's just a bunch of misinformation at that point. So the order in which the content is read is absolutely critical. If you can do nothing else, always think about the reading order on the page. Of course, there's more to PDF accessibility than just reading order, but I would say it's the most important part. Okay, so those are like kind of like two of the main functions there. Now, if I were to click on a specific zone, like one of these yellow rectangles, you'll notice that the top menu up here, it lights up with a whole bunch of new options. Now, all of the functionality that we see that just kind of like popped up on our screen here, it's also available on the left-hand side. So I typically hit this little blue toggle switch to hide that second menu, because as a mouse user, I don't use those functions all that much. And if I need to use them, I can always like come over to the left and scroll around and find it. We put a lot of these buttons up here kind of in multiple locations, because for users of ours that have a reliance on a keyboard to navigate the interface, having some of these buttons that are commonly used by a keyboard user, it's better and easier for them, more accessible to them, if it's in like a fixed location sort of at the top of the page, rather than having to navigate through like a scrollable menu. So in general, just for the accessibility of the application, we've put some buttons up here, but I don't use them very often. So I typically hide that menu, because I'm using a laptop with a small screen. So I prefer to have like that extra vertical space on the page. But that's purely just a preference to you. If you want to keep it expanded or collapse it, totally up to you. Same thing with the menu on the side. This is just a thumbnails of the different pages in this document. If you want to collapse that, you can. If you want to like jump forward to a different page, you can look at the thumbnails, scroll through, and kind of select which page you want to jump to. Okay, so with all that said, the most important part of Equidocs, I'm going to mention it right now before we go any further, is this button right here, the one that looks kind of like a computer monitor. So when you are working on a page, if you ever want to press this button, the preview this page button, this one right here, it will open up a separate tab in your browser. And in this browser preview, you get an HTML rendering of the document, or the page rather, that you're currently working on. So the reason that this HTML is important is because this is just a simple like linear reflection of how a screen reader would read this page if you were to stop working and export the document as is. So instead of having to interpret the very complicated and technical tag tree, you're just getting this very simple linear representation of those tags, but just in an HTML format, which is very easy to interpret and kind of understand. So what we're trying to do is take the structure that we see in this HTML and make sure that it's matching the way that we're like visually interpreting things on the PDF itself. So as you make changes back here, it's going to impact how that HTML preview looks, which will ultimately impact how the tags come out of Equinox. For example, if I move my slider like way to the left, like I had before, and if I were to go back to my HTML preview, you'll see the instant change where you get like a bunch of little like fragmented sentences acting as their own paragraphs. Alternatively, if you go way over to the right and you go back to your preview, you will find that you get these like giant paragraphs here, even having that 2-column section just being consolidated together, reading clear across the 2 columns. So obviously, neither of those options are really acceptable. We want to go back to where we had things before, kind of in the middle of the slider, where everything is going to be inside of its own zone and kind of separated out from the corresponding headings. Speaking of headings, once I've got my detection level set to where I want it, usually the first thing that I go for will be my heading structure. Now, anyone new to PDF accessibility, heading structure, I would say, is maybe the second most important part of PDF accessibility beyond the reading order. They're like probably 1 and 1A in my opinion, because the heading structure is the primary mode of navigating a document. It allows users to jump around in the PDF and skip over sections of information that they might not care to read. So maybe they only want to read this particular section. What they would do is they'd be able to navigate through just the headings to get to that section and then read the corresponding information. This is a short document, so a screen reader is going to fly through this document in probably a minute flat anyway. But if it's a 200-page document and what they're looking for starts on page 150, it would be very frustrating if you had to wait around for 149 pages to eventually find what you're looking for. So that heading structure is kind of the primary method of getting to that correct location in the document. So can't overemphasize it enough. It's an extremely important part of what we're doing. And it's really easy to set headings inside of Equinox. So the rules with heading structure, there are several rules. First and foremost, all heading structure starts with a heading level 1. There's no exceptions to that rule. You can't start with an H3 just because you feel like it. If you do, it's illogical heading structure, and you'll be warned by Equinox for making that mistake. But all heading structure will start with H1, and this document is no exception. This content here, this big bold font at the top of the page, this is going to be my heading level 1 for this document. Now, it's a text zone by default because this was an untagged document to begin with. So we just assume that it's text until told otherwise, because all I really did was make this bold and like size 20 font, which is a very common design technique. But since there's no tag wrapped around it to call it a heading, it's our job as a remediator to make sure that we're doing so. So I will change this from a text zone to a heading by either hitting the drop-down menu where it says text for the zone type. I can change it this way to a heading, but I actually prefer to use keyboard shortcuts. So when I want to set a heading level 1, I literally just have to click on the zone and tap 1 on my keyboard, and it will change itself instantly to a heading level 1. This will be a heading level 2 because it's a subheading of this H1. So it's kind of defining like another section of this document. So I will tap 2 on my keyboard and it will change itself to a heading level 2. I'll call these heading level 3s because they're like subheadings of that H2. So they're kind of 3 separate sections here giving more information about this H2. So they're nested inside of this H2. Therefore, I will set them all as H3s. Now, if I were to go back to my HTML preview after just making a few keystrokes, I've now changed those elements and I can see sort of the visual evidence of it here in my HTML, where I have this big bold fonts to kind of confirm that those elements have been identified as headings, whereas everything else on the page is still just in that standard font style. So the reason why I like to set my heading structure kind of early on in a page is because it really makes it easy for me to see the flaws with my reading order that I currently have. Another rule of heading structure is you can't have back-to-back headings of the same level. So for example, here we have an H3 directly followed by another H3. This is considered illogical heading structure. You can have an H1 directly followed by an H2 or an H2 directly followed by an H3. That's fine because it's like properly nested and it's like one layer below. So that's totally fine. But back-to-back H3s without some sort of content in between, it doesn't make logical sense. There needs to be a paragraph or a list or an image or a hyperlink or some sort of information in there to justify this element being set as an H3. So the problem is it's very simple with this page, and you've probably figured it out by now. It's just the fact that we're sitting here with a 1-column reading order, but this is a 2-column section of this page. So the fix is really, really simple. All I have to do is change this in the drop-down menu from 1 to 2 columns and press reorder. And it happens instantly, but when I go back to my preview, I will see that now my paragraphs are directly following their corresponding heading as it should be read. The logic for how this works, just if you're curious, like what's going on behind the scenes, Equinox is simply scanning the page like left to right, top to bottom, pixel by pixel essentially. And every time it intersects with a zone, it labels it next in the reading order sequence. So when you change it to 2 columns, it'll just split the page in half with like an invisible line, and it will apply that same logic to the left column, and then it will finish up over in the right column. Since these zones are straddling that left column, they technically get found first because they're still in the left column. So they remain unaffected by that reading order adjustment. But when we get down here, my reading order goes to 7, 8, 9, and 10, as we would expect it to be read. If you're choosing multi-column layouts, just be mindful of like things that could be hanging out like in the footer. You might have like a little revision date or the author's name or something down here in the corner. Technically, that's in the left column. So if you want it read at the end of the page, instead of like kind of getting inserted into the middle of the 2-column setup, just make sure that you're adjusting that one zone, or if there's a couple of zones or whatever it is. So just be aware of like the logic of what's going on. It applies itself to the entire page. So things that are hanging out down like in the little corners, they might still be disrupting your reading order. So just keep an eye out for those things like in the HTML preview. Okay, and with that said, I've obviously been rambling on for like a half hour now, and I've thrown a lot of info at you. So this is like a logical place to just kind of pause and see, are there any questions at all about anything that I've talked about so far, like PDF accessibility at a high level, the interface, importing documents, simple things like heading structure and reading order, anything at all that I can clarify before we move on?
Hey, Dan, this is Javier. Is it okay if I ask actually like 2, 3 questions?
Sure.
So they're super basic. I was wondering if a user uploads the same document twice, do we get prompted that we're about to, upload the same document again and maybe ask if we want to keep both or replace or something like that?
No, we don't flag you because there can be multiple iterations of a PDF that are like slightly different, but might have like the same file name. Like you might have like corrected a typo. So it's technically like a different document. To the naked eye, it might look the same, but it's actually like a different iteration of the same PDF. So we don't like sort of discriminate against different versions of files because there are many reasons why you might be importing like a duplicate copy or a second copy. So there's really no warning of that because I don't think that we'd be able to like identify like every little exact same detail from one document to the next because they might share the same file name.
Gotcha. Okay. And then the second one was if we're working on, remediating something and, the browser crashes or something like that, is anything auto-saved or do we have to hit save, sort of every once in a while?
So there is a save button right here, which you can press at any time and it will save the page, of course. Now, if you make a change to your page, like let's say I just move that zone a little bit and I try to go to the next page, it'll prompt me to say, hey, do you want to save? And in this case, I'll hit cancel and because I don't really want to. But in general, you're going to hit yes, right? So if you're like clicking through the document page by page, you're saving at the page level. So yeah, of course, like browsers can crash because you got 10 YouTube tabs open or something, or your Chrome needs to update or whatever it may be. Your laptop dies. You're never going to lose anything with Equinox. I mean, worst case scenario, you're halfway through a page and your browser crashes for whatever reason. Like, okay, you might have lost like that half page worth of work, but you log back in and everything will be restored for you up until that point that you last saved, which at most is like half of a page ago.
Gotcha. Okay, cool. Thank you.
Yep, no problem.
Hey, Dan, so there's a lot of questions in the chat. I think Zach has been answering some, but I'm going to ask maybe a couple here that Zach didn't get to, and if anybody wants to chime in, please. Um, let's see. Oh, sorry. Well, looks like Zach actually asked. Let me just ask it this way: is there anybody that asked a question in the chat that Zach answered or didn't answer that isn't clear that you need any um, clarification on?
There's Noel's question about groups, and if you add a person to the group, will that person automatically gain or lose access to documents as you add remove people from documents that were shared with the group previously?
That's a great question. I was actually starting to write that up, but I can answer it verbally for you.
Yeah.
As a user who gets added to a group, that user will have access to those documents shared to that group, but only after a log out and log back in. The same way with removing a user from the group, again, the user will have to log out and log back in to notice those sharing changes.
Okay. Thank you. I had a question about when you were going through, for example, the headings. Can you control click on 3 different headings and change them all at once to heading 3 or whatever it is? Or do you have to do it individually?
Individually, there are some accessibility limitations of like multi-selecting different zones at the same time. So to keep Equidocs an accessible interface and application, we limit it to just one zone being manipulated at a time. However, there are documents that, let's say you are using like a heading template throughout, and the consistency of like every zone that contains this type of font is going to be set as an H2 in the document. You can set the first one as an H2 and then hit this use as template checkbox, and all zones moving forward in the document containing this type of content will automatically be set as an H2 for you. This doesn't work with every document. Just to be clear, like let's say your document has been OCR'd because it's like scanned. Well, we don't have any of that sort of font information to base that sort of template setting off of. So those types of documents, you will have to manually set your headings throughout. Or if it's like a Frankenstein document where it's 3 different PDFs that have been strung together as one document, and there's not always like a complete reliance on the font style to identify heading structure. So certain instances, you still have to be aware of your headings and setting them like in a more logical way throughout the document, like step by step, page by page. But if you have like some sort of report template where it's very consistently formatted, you can set up a heading template. So that's one less thing that you have to worry about as you're going through the document.
Right. And that auto applies once you've checked it for any text that follows that font size and type and stuff in the document?
Yes, but only related to heading structure. So these text zones are text just by default, and they don't need to be changed. But it's if you want to identify headings, you can set up a template, and it will apply itself to the pages moving forward in the document that you have not yet visited. So we don't like backtrack and override decisions that you might have made on previous pages. But if you're on the 5th page and you have 100 more pages in front of you, it will apply that heading template to all of the next 100 pages.
Thank you.
Hey, Dan, so one question here, and maybe just kind of as a baseline, and I think you started to go down this path with the reading order being one, but one of the questions from Amy is, do you have a quick five quick steps for a basic document that would get a document to minimal levels? Maybe just kind of like walk through like, what are the elements, the 5 kind of, most critical elements of remediating a document that need to be focused on in addition to reading order?
Well, to make something as basic as possible, I would import it. I would import the document. I would move my zone detection slider until I found an appropriate setting for that particular type of document, depending on the fonts. I would apply it to all pages. I would, at a bare minimum, set a heading level 1 for the document. I would probably if I were to, part of like my process would be to go to the images tab in the document detail page, which we haven't really covered yet, but I would add alt text to my images or make decisions from here about artifacting them. And then I would at least click through the document and look for like outliers. So like tables, I would go through and make sure that I'm doing something with the tables and any like obvious lists, which we'll get to like on how we go about tagging those. But that would be like if I'm trying to do like a quick and dirty remediation to make something just kind of like bare minimum pass an accessibility checker. But it's not necessarily like recommended for true usability because there can be a lot more nuance to these PDFs that need to be sort of interpreted by a human going through and remediating it.
I have a more simple question. I missed how we got to the remediation page. How did we navigate here from the import section?
Okay, so I imported the document and then I went back to the document list. And this is like the document, of course. So I just click on the thumbnail, or you can click on edit.
Mm-hmm.
And then from here, you just click on the page that you'd like to go to.
Okay, thank you.
Okay. A couple of other things on this page, not necessarily things that we have to do to this page, but just things to keep in mind when you're remediating. Repetitive elements or things that you as a remediator want to mark as an artifact. So it's kind of a misconception in the PDF world that all things on all PDF pages must be tagged no matter what. That's not exactly true. I guess if you're in doubt, just like tag it. But if you have repetitive elements or decorative things or watermarks in the background or just simple like little design characteristics on the page to make it look a little bit prettier, these types of things can be marked as artifacts. So an example of that on this page might be like this header at the top of the page. If you just think about like what this header says, it says sample document created for Equidox training. Well, the H1 is PDF sample document for Equidox training. The document title is Equidox PDF training sample file. Like how many times do we need to like repeat the same basic phrase? So this is an example of like something that if you don't want to, like you don't have to keep this as part of the tagged reading order. So you can click on it and you can either hit the remove zone button or you can just hit backspace on your keyboard. That zone will disappear from the page itself. The content within it does not vanish. It will still be there as part of the PDF for like any sighted reader, but you are determining that this is just redundant information that a screen reader user does not need to hear. If you think about like how your eyes just kind of glance past headers and footers when you're looking at a document, the screen reader user kind of wants that same experience. They don't want to have this speed bump waiting for them at the top of every single page in the document. So you can artifact it by just hitting backspace or clicking on that remove zone button. And if you go to your preview after making that change, you will see that it's no longer included up here. It's gone. The other thing on this page is down here, I have like a page number. So this page number, these page numbers in PDF documents, they're kind of like obsolete in the digital world. PDF was, initially like more of a print format where you wanted like to put a little page label on every page, because if you print off a 200-page report and someone says, look at page 183, you can just thumb through the document and quickly find it. So these page labels have like a specific purpose kind of in a physical packet of paper sort of world. But in the digital world, every PDF reader and assistive technologies, like they know what page they're on. As you scroll through the document, they can take you to a specific page if you just type in the number of the page that you want to go to. So this functionality is just like built into the digital PDF. So this number down here, it's really nothing more than a potential source of confusion. If you look at like the last line of this paragraph, I of course built this on purpose, but these things happen more often than you think. But it says section 1 period, 10 period, 32 period, and then that 1 would be read directly after that sequence of numbers. So it's important to kind of consider like the experience of a screen reader user who's hearing this read out loud, not so much seeing this on the page. It would be very easy for them to conflate that sequence of numbers with that number 1, because they're truly being read directly, like, it's going right from one to the next. So your ear might automatically just kind of combine those numbers together. And now you're on a wild goose chase looking for a section of this document that doesn't even exist because you just misunderstood something. So again, like these page numbers in general, you can remove them. You can hit backspace on your keyboard to get rid of them. But just to show you another little trick, I wouldn't really use this trick for a 2-page document, but I can put like a little zone over this, like in this general area of the page where it's intersecting with the page number. And I can hit I on my keyboard, I for ignore, or I can change this to an ignore zone in the drop-down menu. And what the ignore zone will do is, despite the fact that I have a text zone around that number 1, the ignore zone is going to ensure that it's actually artifacted. So it's no longer included over here in the HTML preview. But the cool thing about the ignore zone is that if I were to like save the page, and I'll mark the page validated because we're done with it, and I go to the next page, the ignore zone is right there waiting for me. So it duplicates itself on every page, so that I don't have to remember to like scroll to the bottom corner and click on that like same repetitive zone and artifact it on every single page. So it's a way of kind of, consolidating a lot of small steps into one quick step that you don't have to then think about ever again as you're going through the document. Again, I don't really bother with it on a 2-page PDF, but 20 pages, 200 pages, it can be a big time saver and kind of ensure that you're not forgetting about it half the time and leading to like an inconsistent experience for the end user. I will say this, like, don't completely fall in love with the ignore zone. Like, don't just start using it like for like, like willy-nilly all over the page. They should never be like in the middle of the pages. It's virtually, I can't think of a single example when it would be appropriate to put like an ignore zone in the middle of the page, because it might be fine for the page you're currently looking at, but you could be inadvertently artifacting important content later on in the document. So your ignore zone should always be like very discreet and out of the way, typically like in the corners of the pages. All they have to do is intersect with something. They don't have to fully like engulf an area of the page. Don't make an ignore zone that's this large. There's no reason for it. Just keep them small and out of the way, just touching the area of the page where you have like that fixed header or footer repetitive element that you want to artifact. Okay, so this page will go a bit quicker because it's, kind of more of the same of what we just did. I'm going to artifact the header by hitting backspace. This is going to be a heading level 2, so I tap 2 on my keyboard. And here I notice that I've made a bit of a design, sort of oversight. All these other paragraphs where I have the heading level 2, I have a very clear like carriage return, like a big gap between my H2 and the subsequent paragraph. But it looks like I forgot to do that on this one example here, which can happen, right? There can be like little tiny design inconsistencies. Now I might have been able to solve this by moving my slider around on this page, but just to show you, it's also very easy to just like resize the zone, tap 2 on your keyboard, and then click and drag to just create a new zone. So once I draw that new zone, I've got my H2 and I've now recaptured my paragraph. If I go to my HTML preview, things again look a little bit fuzzy over here, because how did this paragraph get to the very top of my reading order? Well, what happened was I already had a reading zone number 1 up here for the header. And because I marked it as an artifact, I deleted zone 1. Suddenly I had a number that was available in the reading order. So when I drew this new one by like physically adding it manually by clicking and dragging, this took over reading zone 1. So again, just hit the reorder button and everything will reset itself and be in like the correct reading order that you would expect. There are 2 images on this page. These images really are not that, they're not really like, obviously they're not like technical images that are offering a ton of value here, but just for example's sake, if with images, you have 2 options. You can either give them a description or you can mark them as an artifact. There's no in between. It's just an either or type of proposition. So you either can artifact them so that they're eliminated from the tagged reading order because you're determining them to just be decorative or not offering anything of value to the page. Or if you feel like they are offering value to the page, you can put in a description. Under the page tab, there is a checkbox that says images. You can deselect that and the images will like automatically be removed from the page. And if you go to the preview button, you'll see that they're no longer included over here. If you want to just artifact one image at a time, like take this image here, for example, I can simply hit backspace on my keyboard and just that one image will be eliminated and I'll be left with the Equinox logo. Now, if I wanted to describe the Equinox logo here, all I have to do is click on it. And here in the description field, I can type in my alt text, which would be something as simple as Equinox logo. Really no reason to go any deeper than that. There's nothing like, you know, don't be like overly verbose in your alt descriptions, especially for simple images like logos. Like I don't have to include that it's like it's all uppercase and there's like a blue circle in term for where the O should be with a check mark inside of it. Like that's all just extra fluff that does nothing but slow a screen reader user down. This is just a simple description to make sure that they're aware that there's just a simple logo here. There's not like a pie chart or a scatter plot or some sort of like very technical important image that's giving a bunch of new information about this document. I'm frequently asked about long description and title. These are simply just HTML properties. They really serve no purpose in the PDF world. So if you plan to export your document back to a PDF, just ignore these the long description and the title field. Just ignore them altogether. They really don't offer anything. There's nowhere for them to go in the PDF world. So they're just kind of lost when you export it. But if you feel like converting your document into HTML, which is always an option that you have with Equinox, you can add a long description, which acts kind of like a caption to the image or a title to the image itself. But in general, I find that most users are exclusively exporting their documents back to PDF. So in general, just worry about the description field. This is all you need to focus on for compliance and making sure that the image in the PDF has a description so that a screen reader user hears what it is based on your interpretation of it and whatever you type into this field. Okay, any questions about this page here, like changing zones or moving them around, resizing them, drawing new ones, alt text, anything at all? Okay. I marked this page as validated as well, just so everyone's aware. The validation feature is important, especially when you're collaborating on documents. So if you notice, these two pages now have like a check mark indicating that they're finished. There's also like a status bar over here that says like 2 out of 2 have been marked as complete. So it's 100% finished. It's valuable because if you're working on a document in multiple sittings, like at normal speed, I'm importing this document, remediating it in like 30 seconds and moving on with my day. But if this were a couple hundred pages long, I might be doing it over multiple sittings, 20 minutes here and there between meetings. Before you know it, like a week has gone by and I can't even remember like which pages I've done, which pages I skipped. Maybe someone else logged in and helped me with this document for a little bit. So rather than wasting 10 minutes just clicking around and trying to figure out where you should pick up, if you're marking pages as validated, it just lets yourself know or other people know that these pages are finished. So there's no reason to like waste time like going into them and clicking around and making a mess of what's already been done. So it's an important little like sort of communication tool for managing your projects, for reminding yourself and others what's done and what needs to be worked on still. So it's a good habit to be in to mark the page as validated. And now that we're done with the 2 pages, my final step would be to go to the export tab. So the export tab brings me to these different options. So I have PDF, HTML, and EPUB as my sort of primary export formats. Like I said, most users are exclusively exporting to PDF, so that will be like the default option. I don't have to do anything here other than press Generate PDF. If you want to change the file name, you can, but most people want to like maintain the exact same file name. So if that's the case, just leave this blank. But if I hit Generate PDF, it will produce a brand new document for me. So this new document that comes out of Equinox, if it wants to come out, if my browser doesn't freeze on me. Let's see if we can see here. A little bit sluggish this afternoon. Maybe my internet connection is a little bit slow. I'm sure it will be there. I'm sure the status bar just froze. Might have to do the old refresh. Yeah, it was there the whole time. So here's my file. This is the link to it. It says that I exported it at 4:28 p.m. So this is the export that I just generated. It didn't pop up like it's supposed to, just my browser decided to take a nap on me. But here is the PDF that we just generated. So you can see when I open it up here, it's the same file that we started with. But if I were to download this version of it, and I'll put this one on my desktop just so I don't get them confused, I can go to the original, which is here. And of course, this is an untagged PDF completely. And if you run the accessibility checker, which a lot of people do when they are, it's just kind of like a standard workflow for people that are working in accessibility, you can see that it just lights up with all kinds of different issues because it's an untagged PDF. Therefore, virtually everything is wrong. But if we go to the new one, and I run the accessibility check, everything is fixed except for these two warnings. So if you see these two warnings, just know that these are to be expected. These are not failures of any kind. It's just Acrobat rather is telling you that it doesn't know what your reading order should be, so check annually. It also has no idea how to check for color contrast. And to be honest, you don't want to be like trying to edit PDFs for contrast anyway. It's kind of a losing battle. You'll end up breaking the document more times than not. PDFs are not really meant to be like manipulated like that, where you're changing fonts and background colors. So these are to be expected, but in general, you just ignore these completely. If you go to the accessibility tags panel here, you can see that the entire document is now tagged. And if you want to like tab through this just to see like what we've built, you can see that like everything is reading in the correct order. All of the heading structure that we set up is there. All of the content is collected and kind of organized as we would expect. Here's our Equinox logo description for our figure there. Everything like the headers and the footers that we artifacted and the image here you can see is not tagged, but everything in this is exactly as we saw in the HTML preview. So if you're comfortable working in Acrobat and you are used to like interpreting the tag tree and know how to work through it, feel free to use Acrobat as kind of like another method of validating your work. But with Equinox, you are getting accessibility checks, not only through the HTML preview, but when you export the document, you will also get warning messages. So let's just say hypothetically, like I make a couple of mistakes, like I'll set this as an H3, then I'll set an H1, then I will go to this here and I'll get rid of my alt description. So I've just like intentionally like had a couple of oversights. If I go and export my document again, then Equinox is going to produce this new document for me. But as you can see, this time when it gives me a new document, I get these warning messages. So it's letting me know like, hey, you've forgotten these things, go back and correct them. So I'm expecting to get those warnings when I'm intentionally making mistakes. But just so you know, the warnings that you get out of Equinox are essentially going to be like mirror images of what you see in your accessibility report in Acrobat. So even if you don't have Acrobat on your machine, or you don't even know how to interpret the tags in Acrobat, like don't worry, you can rely on Equinox to kind of watch your back when you export the PDF. So with all of that said, that's obviously a long-winded way to go through a very simple document, but those are like core foundational principles that are very, very important for all PDF documents. Are there any questions, anything that I can clarify about that entire workflow before we jump into some other documents? Okay, cool.
Dan, it looks like we have a question. Brittany?
Thank you. So you mentioned that Equinox will warn you when you're exporting about items that need your attention. There is no way to proactively look to see what needs attention on the front end. Is that correct?
Unfortunately, no. I mean, the assumption is that if the document is going into Equidocs, it's already been flagged for having accessibility issues. We are doing those accessibility checks when we are recompiling the PDF. So while the document is inside of Equidocs, it's kind of like a deconstructed PDF temporarily. And then when you're finished setting up all of your reading zones, we recompile that PDF together. And it's at that point, when we're putting it all, the puzzle pieces back together, that's when we're making sure that you have created a logical tag structure that's going to be compliant. So there needs to be that step of like exporting it to trigger all of those warnings.
What does that messaging look like when it's trying to flag you during the export? Does it just say there's fields that need review, or?
So this here, like I have a couple of warnings here. So the first heading was not an H1, it was an H3. So say it says verify it. I skipped heading levels. So I went from H1 back to an H3. So it's saying that's not right. Go verify it. And then I had another one that was missing a description on page 2. So my image description on page 2 was a mess. And then this one here, this one, kind of ignore this one for now, but this was just because I intentionally made a bunch of mistakes. So I get this metadata warning, but that one can kind of be ignored. It says on page 0 because it doesn't actually have a specific page that it lives on. But the 2 individual pages here, like they have 3 combined warnings. So those were what I was expecting. I would go back in here, make my corrections, set this as an H1, set this as an H2, and then keeping these as H3. And then of course I would go to my image and either artifact it or type in Equidocs logo. And then when I log out again, or when I export it again, it will come out as a clean report.
Okay. So those warnings will live in the history tab?
Yes, they will.
Okay. Thank you.
And of course, like, it's not like a one and done. You have to get it right because, you know, ideally you'll get it right and you'll export it and get a clean bill of health. But if you got a 200-page document, you might have a couple of oversights in there. So you can just go back to those pages where you had those little mistakes, make a correction, and export it again. So you don't have to get it like perfect, like on the first try. Ideally you will, but if you have to go back and kind of touch a couple things up, you always, like, everything that you've been working on is restored for you. You can just go to the pages where those mistakes are at and make your corrections. Okay, let's go to, real quick, we were talking about like headings on like heading templates. Like this is an example of like where it works. So I'll set this element here as an H1 and then this one as an H2. And then I'll say use as template and save this page. Now, if I go to the next page, I already have an H2 right here waiting for me. If I go to the page after that, here's another H2, another H2. So I'm not having to worry about my heading structure in this document because the font style is consistent throughout all 4 of these pages. So I'm able to set it once and just kind of, you know, rely on the automation to help me out for the rest of the way. This is another document where it's worth talking about like the images tab. So the images tab, obviously there's a bunch of images in this document, right? There's like, I don't know, 10 of them maybe. So yeah, there's 10. Now, if you have like a good familiarity with the document, you might be able to look at these thumbnails and just quickly type in your descriptions for these images kind of in one quick step, and that's great. Or maybe the professor that created this document gives you a spreadsheet of alt text and you're just kind of copy and pasting the alt text to match up with the image. Or if you have a document, maybe you don't have a lot of documents like this, but there are documents where every page has the same logo in the left-hand corner. And it's, you know, it's just the ASU logo. And you don't need 200 iterations of the same logo. It's completely redundant. What you can do in those types of instances is you can select this hide all zones and then deselect the all visible checkbox. And you'll notice that all of those fields to type in the alt text can like disappear. So you can artifact all of those images throughout the entire document with just like one quick step. Now, I wouldn't do that on this type of document because these are obviously like technical images with specific meaning and significance in the document. But if you have like a document where it's truly just decorative images that don't need descriptions, you might find it valuable to just kind of bulk artifact them. And then of course, like save your properties if you make any changes. So different ways of using this images tab. You can do your images up front. You can wait until the very end. Someone might give you alt descriptions that you want to kind of copy and paste in here. Or you might use this as like an artifacting tool where you get rid of all images at once. So different ways of leveraging it, but this is just at a high level, like how it works. It's good to have like a consolidated collection of all the images in the document scattered across many different pages. In this document, or like if you want to go to the page, of course, we've already talked about like the images checkbox, turning them on and off. Or if you want to artifact one at a time, you can just click on it and hit backspace. This image is interesting because it actually has like text inside of it. So this is something that you might come across from time to time, just to make everyone aware of like how this works. Instead of me sitting here and like trying to retype all of this information that the author has already written, but it just happens to be like trapped inside of an image, there's no way for a screen reader to penetrate this image and extract that text. So what I can do is I can use OCR. I can create a zone and put it right on top of that content. I can change the zone source. So if I scroll down a little bit, there's a section that says zone source. The default zone source is PDF. And all that means is whatever is encoded into the document, we just put a tag around it. So that's what you see in the HTML preview. This is all the encoded content in that document. Therefore, that's what's going to show up here because we're just wrapping a tag around whatever happens to be there. But if I change that zone source to OCR, I can now hit convert to text. And then the OCR engine will extract the text from this image. And I get my text result right here. So it's like a form of artificial intelligence, essentially, where it's able to analyze this little screenshot of this text, and it gives me my result. And I'm also like able to correct my result. So like, for example, the word agriculture happens to be like hyphenated. So like I can fix that. I have Grammarly installed. So Grammarly is like very picky, of course, about like writing styles, but so it doesn't really agree with the author here, but you can adjust and correct your result as much as you'd like. You can even add to it or enhance it with any other information you'd like. But the cool thing is that if I go to my preview now, I'm not just stuck with that image here. I still have the image, but this is the text that I just extracted from it. So now I can put this text into the reading order so that the screen reader user has the exact same experience. And I'm not wasting my time retyping all of this where I'm liable to have, a bunch of spelling errors and things like that. One other quick thing on this page about reading order. Of course, we talked about reading order, like the one column reading order. This is a page here where I'm a stickler for my reading order. I always like to have my heading level 1 be read first on a page whenever possible, or on a document whenever possible. But because of the layout of this page, no matter how many times I hit this reorder button, this is going to be reading zone 1, this is 2, this is 3, this is 4, this is 5. So this is always going to be stuck there as like reading zone 5 just due to the layout of the page. So I have the order field over here where I can manipulate the order of just one zone at a time. And you might be thinking like, okay, like change the reading order from 5 to 1, and then come up here and change 1 to 2 and 2 to 3 and 3 to 4 and like play musical chairs with all of these zones on the page. But I really don't have to do that. I can just click on the one zone that happens to be out of order and put a period in front of it. So I can make it 0.5. And now it will jump to the top of the reading order and everything else will slot in behind it. So the reading order, you're not locked into using like whole numbers. You can use decimals, you can skip numbers, you can really use any sequence that you would like, anything that's lowest to highest, and that will determine the tagged reading order that comes out of Equidocs for that specific page. So if I want my H1 first, I don't need to shuffle 5 zones around to make room. I just click on the one zone that's kind of out of order and squeeze it in with the decimal system. Same can be said about like this image. You know, maybe I want, this is reading zone 10. So maybe I want it to come after the H2, but before this paragraph. Well, I have 8, 9, and 10. So what do? Well, I just changed 10 to 8.1. And now it's going to end up where I want it, which is directly after the H2. This text, it's currently reading zone 12 on the page just because of the layout. So if I want it to come directly after the image, well, I'll just make it 8.12. And now that text will directly follow the image. So you have like the flexibility to just kind of squeeze zones in using the decimals. Again, not having that cascading effect of one thing is out of order, so now everything needs to move around to make room for it. Okay, so that's the other pages in this document are quite redundant. You know, it's more of the same, so we won't continue to go down that path. I do want to make sure that we talk about two other element types, which would be tables and lists. Very common elements that you'll see a lot of in PDFs. So we'll start with lists. I'll go to this document here. There's obviously like some examples of lists on this document. But if I jump into the page here, just for consistency, I'm going to set heading structure just so it looks a little bit nicer on the preview. So if I look at my preview before making any further changes, what you'll commonly see with things like lists are that they're sitting inside of a text zone. So the screen reader, a machine, it doesn't know that this is actually supposed to be a list. As far as it's concerned, it's just like a block of text. So it's going to read everything as just like one big run-on sentence without any punctuation. So that can be very confusing and very difficult to navigate for a screen reader user. So a list structure is really important because it allows a user to navigate and travel within this list. So if they just misheard the 6th list item, they could listen to just that item again. They don't have to start over at the very beginning and have everything blended together as like some strange sounding paragraph. So list detection is very simple, really simple in Equidox. All I have to do is click on this zone, which currently contains the entire list. I can then hit L on my keyboard, L for list, and it will move me down to the list detector. And in the list detector, I can just simply nudge this slider from left to right. And you'll notice that as soon as I press that or move that slider over, it will create all 6 of those list items for me. And if I go back to my HTML preview, suddenly I see my 6 lists, and they are delineated by these bullet points. So that's really the structure that I'm looking for. So now it matches what I see in the PDF. I'm not seeing like a strange looking sentence for this element, which is clearly a list. When you get into more complicated lists like these two, so this is what's called an ordered list. And an ordered list is a bit different than sort of a standard unordered list where you just have bullet points or dashes or squiggly lines or arrows or just sort of like non-sequential list labels. When you get into the ordered lists, it's a little bit different because like the 1, 2, 3, and 4, or the A, B, C, and D, or the Roman numerals that might be being used in an ordered list, those characters, you don't want those extra characters to be read as part of the list item, right? You don't want there to be like a list label and then the list item itself reads 1. This is an ordered list. Like you want it to know that these numbers are in fact what are supposed to be tagged as the list labels themselves. So if I hit L on my keyboard and I do the exact same thing that I just did and I nudge my slider from left to right, okay, great. I have my list items. But when I go to my preview, what you'll find is that I have the bullet points here, but the 1, the 2, the 3, the 4, all of those little list labels, they're sitting inside of the list item. So this isn't like rendering the entire document completely useless. Like a screen reader user can like power through this for the most part and figure out what's going on here, but it's not optimal, right? And it's not the best possible sort of result that we can get out of Equidox. So what I recommend when you're dealing with an ordered list is with your slider, go at least to the 2nd setting And when I drop it on the second setting, that little wheel that's spinning around, that's the artificial intelligence kind of working on things right now. And the artificial intelligence is smarter than that first list detection level, which is very sort of elementary. It's just seeing a bullet point and creating an item. But the artificial intelligence powered settings, which are settings 2, 3, 4, and 5, you have like different variations of it. It's smart enough to look inside of these list items, and it's picking out that there's a high likelihood that the 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6 over here on the extreme left side, those are probably the list labels. So now all I have to do is tell Equidox that this is an ordered list by hitting this radio button. And I go over here to my style type and I tell it that it's numbers. And when I go back to my preview, I have list labels that match the style of the PDF. But also, I'm not getting that duplication where my 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 are not being read as the list item. They're actually acting as the list labels themselves, which is really what you want. So it's one extra little step, but it makes a difference to the end user. The same can be said for nested lists. So nested lists are more complicated in the sense that you have a list inside of a list item, which is part of a larger list. So these can be detected as well. But you do want to use the list detection slider again and go to at least the second setting. If I just call it a list and I go to my first item here, like, okay, great. It finds that there's a bunch of list items there. But when you look at the preview after doing that, that is not how that list is intended to be read. These two items are a sub item of that first item there. So it needs that structure. And if you go to your second setting, it's going to, again, trigger the artificial intelligence. And as it figures out this list, what it's going to give me are 3 main list items, but then it looks inside of them and it finds that there's other sub lists in there. And it will give me the correct result in my HTML preview, which is what I'm looking for. There are other list detection settings. So you have like 5 different settings, and settings 2, 3, 4, and 5, they all use artificial intelligence. So it's just like different variations of an algorithm. Like you don't have to do all the mathematics that are going on behind the scenes. The slider's handling that for you. But if you don't get like the perfect result with the second setting, try the third, try the fourth, try the fifth, see which one works best for that particular list. If all else fails, which I don't find it failing very often at all, like you can always like create a zone, call it a list, and then just like tell Equidox that it has 4 items, and then like you can drag them around and move them into place if you need to. I very infrequently ever have to do that, but if you need to build a list because you have some sort of crazy, unorthodox, poorly designed list, you can create one manually that way if you need to. But in general, 95% of the time, if not more than that, you're just going to be calling it a list and nudging the slider. So any questions here about lists before we jump over into tables? Okay. All right, let's talk tables. Tables are another really important PDF structure that you'll come across pretty often. This document here has a couple of tables. We'll go to, well, we don't really need page 1. We'll go to page 2. Page 2 has this table on it. Now I'll just move the slider. I'll set my H2. I'll set my list. And that will just kind of leave us with this table that we have to focus on. So if we zoom in a bit here, visually, we can very clearly see that this is supposed to be a table. The data is organized, kind of in like this grid. We have these grid lines around all of the data cells. A sighted user has no problem just glancing at this table and extracting all of the information from it. But if you don't have or if you are blind and you're using a screen reader, the screen reader needs a proper table structure to be able to interact with this. Otherwise, what you end up giving the screen reader user is, something like this. It's just a bunch of random information being read in a crazy order that is basically just determined by like the layout of the zones or the random layout of the tags. So it's obviously unacceptable to just export this table without going through the steps of making sure that it's accessible. So table remediation is notoriously slow and difficult and challenging in Adobe Acrobat, but it's much easier in Equidox. So there's really like no excuse to skip tables anymore. So if you see a table, all you really have to do is just put a zone on top of it like so. So now I have one zone sitting on top of my table. Ignore everything that's there already. Don't worry about it. We're going to override all of those existing zones. Now that I've got my zone on top of my table, I can change it to a table in this drop-down menu, or I can just hit T on my keyboard. When I hit T, it becomes a table. There's a button for the table editor down below if you scroll just a little bit, or what I end up doing is I just double click on the table itself, and it will take me into the table editor. When I'm in the table editor, I can see that there are these green grid lines here, which if you really feel like it, you can like click on them and move them around, but I almost never do that. I just rely on the table detection. So the initial detection for this table, it's a little bit scrambled. This is kind of a crazy looking table with lots of like white space and random lists and giant paragraphs inside of it. So it's not really like a very uniform type of table. So the initial sort of blind guess that Equinox took is not exactly spot on. But I haven't even woken up the artificial intelligence yet. So the table detector, these little sliders down here, literally all I have to do is just wake it up by nudging one of these sliders. And the artificial intelligence is really, really good at figuring out the table structure here. So you can see all of these different cells have been identified, and they're sitting inside of like these little green grid lines. I don't really have anything else that I need to adjust. If I look at my HTML preview after just nudging that slider, you can see it's a pretty dramatic difference where I actually have like tabular data structure. So I have data cells, which are showing up with that standard font style. And then I have like the bold font style in my top row and my far left column. That bold font is an indication of table data, or I'm sorry, of table headers. So these are my table headers in my far left column and my top row, which is kind of the average table, right? So we have your column headers and you have your row headers. That ratio can be adjusted over here. So you have your column and row headers here, which are sitting at a 1-to-1 ratio by default. I'm leaving them alone for this table. The next one we look at, I'll actually change these a bit. Another thing that we can do is provide a table summary by just hitting this auto summarize checkbox. So when I hit the auto summary button, it will give me like a very simple table summary. You don't necessarily have to provide a table summary. It's not really related to compliance, especially for a simple table. It's kind of redundant and obsolete in some ways. But if you have a complicated table, it really never hurts to add one. You know, a table that has multiple headers, span cells, empty cells, or different things in a table can add to the complexity of it. But this is a pretty straightforward table. So the table summary is very simple by design. So it's just 4 rows and 4 columns. But when I save the table and I hit the X and I close out, all of those zones that I had there before, they have been eliminated. So they've been replaced by just this one single table zone. So now my entire page, when I look at it in the preview, it looks a lot better than what we had before. Now there are lists inside of these table cells, which I would argue is not like, probably not the best design. It's kind of complicating things beyond what it needs to be. But I can still put a zone on top of that list, hit L just like I normally would, and detect my list just as any regular list would be detected. So there's nothing different about this list here. When I go to my preview after creating it, it's now going to be a list living inside of a table data cell. So something that Equinox can handle. Hopefully you don't come across this too much because it's not really the best design. It's a little bit complicated, but it's easy enough to account for inside of Equinox. And I do want to go to this little bit more complex looking table here. So this table is maybe a little bit more like uniform in terms of its style, like the data cells themselves are kind of it's structured in a little bit more of like a standard way. But again, if you look at the preview, we know that this is just going to be a disaster. There's not a single person in the world that can make any sense of this. So we don't want to leave the table that way. And to fix it, we're just going to create one zone like so. We are going to hit T on our keyboard and double click to open up the table editor. And that's going to bring us back to where we just were. And I'm going to nudge my sliders to wake them up. And immediately I have something that, structurally resembles that PDF table now. There are two things though to account for. In my top row up here, you'll notice how like the word level and level 1, and then they're flanked by empty cells on either side. What happened here is that level 1 is actually a column header that is intended to act as a column header for all 6 of these columns. But the content itself is only like physically located in these 2. So you end up with like blank cells here, which is kind of a no-no. You don't ever really want to have blank header cells in a table. Cell like 1A, you know, the very first cell, if that's blank, that's okay. That's like pretty standard design. It just happens. It's just the way that tables are built. That one's okay. But when you get into like column headers that have data that correlate with them, that's important because all of the information in this column needs to have a column header to relate to. Now, if I want to do what's called a span, it's very simple in Equidox. All I have to do is click in a cell where I want the span to begin, hold Shift on my keyboard, and click above the cell where I want the span to finish. I now have all 6 of these cells collected, and there's a span button that becomes available, or I can just hit S on my keyboard, and then that span will be created for me. So now I have level 1 straddling all 6 of those columns. The other trick with this table is that it's not a standard 1-to-1 ratio with my column and row headers. I want to make sure that my second row is also going to be tagged as headers because all of the data in these columns, they relate to not only like the level 1, level 2, and level 3, but they have a sub header here that is important for them to be associated with as well. So I change my column header from like the standard 1-to-1 ratio. I just change it from 1 to 2. And when I go back to my preview, all of those different cells are now showing with that bold font to give me that visual confirmation that they have been tagged as headers, whereas all of the standard font down below here in the middle of the table is going to be tagged as table data. So now this is structured properly so that regardless of what cell a screen reader user finds himself in, if they're in this cell right here, they're no longer just like lost in the middle of this sea of information. They know specifically that they are in the mobile device row, that it's the level 1 sort of parent column, and then the FERPA sub column. So they can freely roam around in this table, and they're always aware of where they're orientated. And again, if I hit the auto summarize checkbox, all of that information that's required programmatically writes itself. And again, you can just save the table. 2 other quick things, like if you want to like, and I don't really do this very often because the AI is so good. But if I want to like add a row, there's a button up here to add a row, or you can delete a row. You can also hit R and D for like adding a row and deleting a row. The keyboard shortcuts are right there. You can add a column, you can delete a column. Adding a column is C, removing a column is M. So pretty basic like keyboard shortcuts there to add and subtract columns if you need to. Again, I don't do that very frequently. You can also go to the cells tab and there's like a nudge feature, which again, I don't use very often. But if you have a really dense table with like small font, maybe like every row is just like giving the data like a haircut and you just want to move them all up like 1 or 2 pixels. They can all move together in unison so that you don't have to click on every individual one and like move it a little bit and then click on this one and move it a little bit, which is not hard. It's just tedious and it will give you a hand cramp. So we don't have to do that with Equidox. You can nudge them together and until everything looks nice and clean in your preview. I know I've talked a lot about like keyboard shortcuts today. If anyone has a question about keyboard shortcuts, there is a menu of them right here underneath this like lowercase I button. So this is a menu of those keyboard shortcuts. I wouldn't say like memorize them from start to finish, but it is, you know, available to if you need to refer to it. They're pretty intuitive. Once you get the hang of Equidox and use it for a couple of hours, you'll find yourself just doing it automatically. But yeah, that's the best way really to learn is to kind of get your hands on it and apply everything that I've been talking about today to your own documents and, you know, try to like, you know, get into some trouble, if you will, like, you know, figure out some different like trial and error, play with it a bit, see what you get in the HTML preview, and things will start to come together once you get your hands on it and start using it more frequently.